The Khwarezmian Empire was collapsing. Shah Muhammad was dying. His son, Jalal-ud-Din, inherited the struggle. He tried to return to the capital, but the commanders were divided. Jalal-ud-Din left before the Mongols could trap him. Mongol scouts were searching for him, but he escaped their pursuit. Near Nasa, Jalal-ud-Din struck back and defeated a Mongol force. He reached the lands around Ghazni. Warriors gathered around him. He had an army again. Genghis Khan sent an army against him. Jalal-ud-Din chose difficult ground. The Mongols attacked. Jalal-ud-Din led from the front. The Mongols were defeated at Parwan. It was one of Jalal-ud-Din's greatest victories. But victory brought a new danger. The commanders fought over the spoils. Men began leaving the army. His great victory had left him dangerously weakened. Now Genghis Khan pursued him personally. An enormous Mongol army moved after him. Jalal-ud-Din headed east. Then he reached the Indus. But Genghis Khan had caught him. There was nowhere left to retreat. Genghis Khan attacked. Jalal-ud-Din fought desperately, but the Khwarezmian army was overwhelmed. Then he saw one final escape. He rode into the river and survived. He escaped into India. Genghis Khan watched him disappear. He had lost almost everything, but he was still alive. His story was not over. The Mongols had destroyed his empire, but they had failed to destroy him. Now he would have to build a new future, far from the kingdom he had lost.
Jalal-ud-Din had survived, but he no longer had an empire. Only a small force remained with him. This was a different world. India already had a powerful ruler. His name was Iltutmish. Jalal-ud-Din needed allies, but Iltutmish had his own problems. The Mongol shadow was already approaching. Jalal-ud-Din began building his position. More warriors joined him. The exiled king was becoming powerful again. But his position was fragile. Local rulers saw a new rival. Every alliance could become an enemy. And the Mongols had not forgotten Jalal-ud-Din. Genghis Khan's empire still surrounded him. Jalal-ud-Din knew he could not stay forever. After years in India, he turned west. His army crossed back toward Persia. Now he was back in the heart of the old Khwarezmian world. Jalal-ud-Din wanted to rebuild his kingdom, but Persia was already divided. He fought campaign after campaign, but the Mongols were coming back. His old enemy had returned. There would be no peace. Jalal-ud-Din continued west. His campaigns reached the Caucasus, but every victory created another enemy. Then the Mongols began closing in. He had survived Genghis Khan, but the Mongol Empire was still growing. Jalal-ud-Din had spent his life fighting. He had dreamed of rebuilding his father's empire, but the old empire would never return, and the Mongol shadow followed him. His final days were approaching. Jalal-ud-Din had lost an empire. He had crossed mountains, he had crossed the Indus, he had fought the Mongols, and he had refused to disappear. But the Mongol Empire was still expanding, and its greatest conquests were still ahead.
After years in India, Jalal-ud-Din returned west. He had no great empire waiting for him. He would have to build one again. Jalal-ud-Din began rebuilding his power in western Iran. He made alliances, and he made enemies. Jalal-ud-Din was becoming a regional power. His ambitions took him toward the Caucasus. The Caucasus was divided among rival powers. Jalal-ud-Din launched campaign after campaign. His campaigns eventually brought him into conflict with Georgia. The fighting was brutal. Tbilisi fell under his control. But every conquest created another enemy. His enemies were beginning to surround him, and beyond them stood the Mongol Empire. The Mongols were coming again. Jalaluddin knew what this meant. The Mongols were closing in. Jalaluddin prepared for another war. He marched to meet the Mongols. Across the valley stood the Mongol army. The armies collided. The Mongols used speed, mobility, and overwhelming pressure. Jalaluddin's army was defeated. In 1230, Jalaluddin suffered a decisive defeat against the Mongols. Once again, Jalaluddin was forced to flee. The king who once commanded armies was now a fugitive. He disappeared into the mountains. In 1231, his long struggle was nearing its end. Far from his former empire, he was attacked. Jalaluddin Mongborni died in 1231. His death ended the final great resistance of the Khwarezmian dynasty. The Mongol Empire continued expanding. What began on the steppe was becoming a world empire. Genghis Khan had created something extraordinary, and the empire would outlive him. But Genghis Khan's story was not the end. The next generation would carry the Mongol conquest even farther. Jalaluddin was gone. His kingdom was gone, but the Mongol Empire was only getting started. In 1227, Genghis Khan died. He left behind the largest connected empire the world had yet seen. But one question remained: who would rule the empire? Genghis Khan had 4 famous sons. Jochi was the eldest. Chagatai was known for his strict character. Ogedei was chosen to succeed his father, and Tolyu was the youngest. The Mongol nobles gathered for a great Kurultai. The choice was Ogedei. Ogedei became the second Great Khan. Ogedei did more than conquer. He began organizing the empire. Messenger routes connected distant parts of the empire. Orders could travel across enormous distances. Ogedei also developed Karakorum. Merchants began arriving from across Eurasia. The Mongol Empire was becoming a meeting place for different cultures. But conquest had not stopped. In northern China, the war against the Jin continued. By 1234, the Jin dynasty was finished. Then Ogedei turned his attention west. 2 important commanders would lead the next great western campaign. One was Batu Khan, the other was Subutai. The Mongol armies moved west. Before them stood the divided princes of Rus. They were powerful, but they were divided. The next great Mongol conquest was beginning, and this time the battlefield was Europe. The Mongol Empire had reached another turning point, and the armies of Batu and Subutai were about to shock Europe. In 1237, the Mongols began their great invasion of Rus. Batu Khan commanded the campaign. Subutai helped shape its strategy. The first warnings reached the princes of Rus. Rayan prepared for the coming attack. Then the Mongols appeared. Rayan was surrounded. The siege began. For days the defenders resisted, but Rayan fell. The Mongols moved deeper into Rus. Rus forces tried to stop them near Kolumna. The Mongols broke the resistance. Now the Mongols turned toward Vladimir. Vladimir was one of the most important cities of Rus. The Mongols surrounded the city. The defenses could not hold. Vladimir fell in February 1238. The princes of Rus were divided. Grand Prince Yuri tried to gather a new army. At the Sit River, the Mongols defeated the Rus army. Grand Prince Yuri was killed. Then the Mongols reached a much smaller city. Kozelsk refused to surrender. The city resisted for weeks. Finally, the defenders made a desperate attack. Kozelsk fell. After the devastating campaign, the Mongols paused. Then the Mongols returned. Chernihiv became one of the next major targets. After a hard siege, Chernihiv fell. Now only one of the greatest cities of Rus remained. Kiev prepared for the Mongols. In November 1240, the Mongol army reached Kiev. The siege began. The defenses finally broke. Kiev fell in December 1240.
The conquest of Rus was not the end. Beyond the ruins of Rus lay Hungary, Poland, and the kingdoms of Europe, and the Mongols were already moving toward them. By 1241, the Mongols had crossed deep into Europe. Europe was divided into kingdoms, duchies, and rival powers. Now they faced an enemy they had never seen before. The Mongol army split its forces. One force moved toward Poland. Polish lands were suddenly under attack. The Mongol advance threatened Krakow. Krakow was abandoned and burned during the campaign. Henry the Pious gathered an army to confront them. Knights and warriors from different regions joined him. But the Mongols were ready. On April 9, 1241, the armies met at Lignitsa. The European knights charged. The Mongols appeared to retreat, but it was a trap. The European formation began to break apart. Henry the Pious was killed. The Mongols had won. But the main Mongol army was moving toward Hungary. Bela IV knew the danger. Bela had also welcomed the Cumans into Hungary. But suspicion and tension grew. Cuman leader Khotan was killed. The Cumans then left Hungary. The Mongols crossed the Carpathian Mountains. Bela gathered his army near the Sayo River. Batu and Subutai planned carefully. The Mongols attacked during the night. The Hungarians fought back at the bridge. But Subutai found another way across. By morning, the Hungarian army was surrounded. The Battle of Mohi became a catastrophe for Hungary. The Hungarian army broke. Much of Hungary was now open to the Mongols. The Mongols continued their campaign through the winter. Bela fled west. Then something changed. Ögedei Khan had died in 1241. In 1242, the Mongol army withdrew from Central Europe. Europe had survived, but Europe had learned how powerful the Mongols really were. Batu returned toward the steppe. His western territories would become the foundation of what became known as the Golden Horde. The empire was becoming harder to control from one center. Over time, several major Mongol realms would emerge. In barely a few generations, the Mongols had transformed Eurasia. But the greatest challenge was still ahead. Could the Mongol Empire remain united? The Mongols had conquered across continents, but conquest was easier than keeping an empire together. And soon, the Mongol princes would begin fighting each other.
Ögedei Khan was dead, and the greatest empire on earth suddenly had no Great Khan. Ögedei's widow, Teregedei Khatun, became regent. For several years, she controlled the empire, but the succession was becoming a political struggle. Ögedei's son, Guyuk, wanted the throne. He was experienced, ambitious, and determined. In 1246, the Great Kurultai finally gathered. Guyuk was chosen as the third Great Khan. Now he controlled the empire. But the empire had changed. Power was no longer concentrated in one place. Batu Khan had become extremely powerful in the west. His power base was far from the Mongol heartland, and Guyuk and Batu did not trust each other. The rivalry went back generations. Old family resentments were still alive. Then Guyuk marched west. Batu learned that the Great Khan was coming. Two branches of Genghis Khan's family were approaching confrontation, but the confrontation never became a major battle. Guyuk suddenly became seriously ill. In 1248, Guyuk Khan died. Once again, the empire had no Great Khan. Ogul Kaimish became regent, but another powerful candidate was emerging. Möngke was a grandson of Genghis Khan. Batu supported Möngke's claim. The struggle moved toward another great Kurultai. In 1251, Möngke became the fourth Great Khan. A new era had begun. Möngke wanted to restore central authority.
He would send his brothers to conquer in different directions. Hülegü would lead the western campaign, and Kublai would continue the struggle in China. Another Mongol army was moving toward the Middle East, and Kublai continued the war in China. The Mongol Empire was expanding again. But beneath the expansion, the empire was changing. Soon, the Mongol princes would no longer fight only foreign enemies. The sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan had inherited an empire, but they had also inherited its rivalries, and the next great war would be fought between Mongols. In the 1250s, Möngke Khan launched a new phase of Mongol expansion. His brother Hülegü was chosen to lead the western campaign. This was not a small raiding force. It was a huge imperial army. Möngke gave Hülegü a clear mission: destroy the major powers that resisted Mongol rule. Persia was first. In the mountains of Persia stood a network of powerful fortresses. One of the most famous was Alamut. The Nizari leader Rukn al-Din Korsha faced Hülegü. Hülegü surrounded the mountain strongholds. The defenders could see the scale of the Mongol army. In 1256, Korsha surrendered to Hülegü. Alamut fell, but Hülegü's greatest target was still ahead. Baghdad was one of the greatest cities in the Islamic world. Baghdad was also the seat of the Abbasid Caliph. The Caliph faced an impossible decision. In early 1258, the Mongols reached Baghdad. Baghdad prepared for siege, but Hülegü had brought an enormous force. The Mongols surrounded the city. Siege engineers began attacking the walls. The defenses began to collapse. On February 10, 1258, Baghdad fell. Al-Musta'sim surrendered to Hülegü. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad had come to an end. The destruction was enormous. Baghdad's intellectual world suffered a devastating blow. Baghdad would never be the same again. But Hülegü was not finished. The Mongols moved into Syria. Even Damascus was threatened. But another power was rising. The Mamluk Sultanate controlled Egypt, and Sultan Qutuz prepared to face the Mongols. Then Hülegü received news from the east. Möngke Khan had died in 1259. Hülegü withdrew most of his army. Now, the Mongols and Mamluks were on a collision course. The future of the Middle East would be decided on the battlefield. Hülegü had destroyed one of the most important political centers of the medieval Islamic world. From these conquests, a new Mongol state would emerge, the Ilkhanate. But Hülegü's greatest challenge was still waiting. The Mongols had conquered Persia, they had destroyed Baghdad, and now they faced an enemy that refused to run. The next battle would change the Mongol advance forever. After Baghdad fell, the Mongol advance continued west. Aleppo fell to the Mongols, then Damascus was threatened. Across the region, the Mongols had become a terrifying force, and Egypt now stood directly in their path. But Egypt was not defenseless. Sultan Qutuz decided to fight. Among his most important commanders was Baybars. The Mongols demanded submission. Qutuz refused. Egypt would meet the Mongols in battle. Then, the balance changed. Möngke Khan had died in 1259. Hülegü withdrew most of his army. Command of the remaining Mongol forces fell to Kitbuka. He had fewer troops than Hülegü had commanded, but the Mongols continued their advance. Qutuz marched north. Baybars led the advance. Both armies searched for the right battlefield. They found it at Ain Jalut. Kitbuka brought his army onto the battlefield. Baybars prepared a trap. The battle began with a Mongol attack. Baybars struck the Mongols with disciplined cavalry. Then, the Mamluks pulled back. The retreat had drawn the Mongols into a trap. The Mongol army was now under enormous pressure. Kitbuka refused to abandon the battlefield. He fought until the Mongol position collapsed. For the first time, a major Mongol army had been decisively defeated in open battle. Kitbuka was killed. Qutuz had won. The Mongol advance toward Egypt had been stopped. But Ain Jalut did not destroy the Mongol Empire. It stopped one Mongol advance, and another conflict was already growing inside the Mongol world. Berke Khan and Hülegü would soon become enemies. For the first time, the descendants of Genghis Khan were preparing to fight each other. The empire was beginning to divide into powerful regional realms. The empire was still enormous, but it was no longer politically united. Ain Jalut became one of the most famous victories against Mongol expansion, but the next Great Mongol War would be different. It would be Mongol against Mongol. The empire that had conquered half the world was now turning its weapons upon itself.
After Ain Jalut, the Mongol world was changing. Möngke Khan had died. His death triggered another struggle for the Great Khan's throne. In the west, Berke Khan ruled a powerful Mongol realm. His realm controlled enormous territories in the western steppe, and its wealth came from trade, tribute, and control of major routes. Berke became the first major Mongol ruler of the Western Empire to embrace Islam. His court increasingly connected the Mongol world with the Muslim societies around it. Farther south, Hülegü controlled Persia and Iraq. His new state was becoming a powerful regional empire. But the two Mongol realms shared a dangerous frontier. The Caucasus was valuable for territory, trade, and revenue. Both sides claimed influence there. Then, the rivalry became personal. Berke was furious. The descendants of Genghis Khan were now preparing to fight each other. Berke sent his forces toward the Caucasus. Hülegü prepared to defend his territory. Mongol fought Mongol. Berke now had another reason to oppose Hülegü. The Mamluks were also enemies of the Ilkhanate. An unlikely alliance began to form. The fighting continued. The frontier became a battlefield. Berke's forces struck hard. Hülegü died in 1265. His son Abaka succeeded him. The rivalry did not disappear with Hülegü's death. The Caucasus remained contested. There was no longer one uncontested center of Mongol power. The Golden Horde ruled the western steppe, the Ilkhanate ruled Persia and Iraq, and other branches ruled Central Asia and China. Genghis Khan had built one empire. His descendants had created several powerful realms. The empire was still vast, but its unity was fading. Berke had helped create something the first Great Khans could never have imagined. Mongol rulers were now forming alliances against other Mongol rulers. The age of one united Mongol empire was ending. But fragmentation did not mean weakness. The Mongols were about to build some of the most powerful states of medieval Eurasia, and their story was far from over.